Welcome, everybody. I am so delighted that April 9 has already arrived, and we warmly welcome Dr. Paige Pullen and Dr. Daniel Hallahan. We are delighted to continue the CC 100th anniversary series and welcome these two amazing parts of our field, lights in our field, what words we want to use. We're so thankful. And Zoom, as much as virtual, you know, there are lots of advantages. This is one of them now, that we can gather together on a Saturday morning from all over the place. A nice number of us, and I welcome each and every single one of you. And I can't tell you how much I would actually love to meet you in person, but maybe indeed some happy day we'll do that. I begin by introducing Dr. Paige Pullen, sorry. We have Pulliam and Pullen this morning. Chief Academic Officer at University of Florida's Lastinger Center for Learning. Dr. Pullen's current focus is on developing and implementing scalable professional learning experiences to increase educators' knowledge of reading instruction. Her research focuses on language and literacy interventions for vulnerable populations. Pullen also has held positions at the University of Virginia School of Medicine and the College of Education. She has served as principal investigator for a myriad of research projects, authored book chapters, peer-reviewed articles, and presented internationally on evidence-based reading instruction. She has continued and research across the globe, including Nigeria, Zambia, Botswana, and Africa. And we have not just Dr. Pullen, but we also have Dr. Dan Hallahan with us this morning. Thank you, both of you. It's my joy to tell you that Dr. Daniel Hallahan is a professor emeritus, University of Virginia in Charlottesville. He received his PhD from the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. His areas of expertise include learning disabilities, ADHD, autism, intellectual disabilities, blindness, and deafness. His early research focused on the development of cognitive strategy training for students with learning disabilities and ADHD. Recently, his research focused on the need for more individualized, intensive special education instruction for students with disabilities. Dr. Hallahan is the author of hundreds of professional articles and book chapters, and he is the author and co-author of more than 20 professional textbooks. His work has been published in German, in Spanish, in Korean, and Arabic. Dr. Hallahan has taught countless pre-service and in-service undergraduate students, as well as countless PhD students. He served as the first editor of Exceptionality and as a reviewer of Exceptional Children, Learning Disability Quarterly, the Journal of Special Education, and Exceptionality. He received numerous awards during his distinguished career as an educator, as a researcher, and for his service to our profession. And I happen to know and cherish these people very, very much. And I welcome everybody. Jump right in now, Paige and Dan, and I think we're ready to go.
Okay, well, thank you for that kind introduction, Paula. We are happy to be here. Unfortunately, Dan is a little under the weather, so that's both good news and bad news. The bad news is he's under the weather. The good news is that we're going to zip through the history and I get to spend more time on reading instruction.
That's good news.
No, I will go through Dan's portion. We worked on this together, and we have published some chapters and articles on the history of learning disabilities, but we will go through the history rather briefly so that we can focus on what's applicable today. But it's important to look at where we've been to know where we are now and where we're going, and how that early research actually has advanced the field and how the field continues to advance. If you are more interested in the history portion, we, at the end of the history section of this PowerPoint, and I will put the references in the chat as well, there's a book chapter and an article that are listed that go through a lot of the material that covers a lot of the material that is in this first part of the presentation. Also, in terms of my presentation style, I tend to be very interactive. So I don't want this to be just a stand and deliver or sit and deliver, as the case may be on Zoom, but I really welcome your questions. And so feel free to pop questions in the chat, and I'll pause occasionally for Paula to read questions to me. I won't be able to see the chat because I've got the presentation up, but feel free to ask questions, and we'll be happy to answer those. So without any more background info, etc., we'll jump right into the history of learning disabilities. And let me say, this is a very brief history. There are many things that we were not able to cover in this presentation that are covered in more depth in the article and the book chapter. Right. So we've done welcome and introductions. We'll then go through a brief history of learning disabilities. At the end, we'll focus on what the future of learning disabilities is, and the bulk of the presentation will be on the science of reading and how that impacts students with dyslexia or other specific learning disabilities. And we'll have a chance for questions and answers. So as you can see, we have a very rich history in the field of learning disabilities, although the term learning disabilities wasn't coined until the 1960s with Sam Kirk. The history begins well before that, beginning with the European period in around the 1850s, all the way through our present day today. And so we'll go through these areas of our history, or periods of history: the European period, the US Foundation period, into what I hope we can now call a space that we're in now, the evidence-based period, where we are taking all of these many years of research and taking what we know and then applying that in evidence-based practices in the identification, the intensive instruction, to ultimately help transform the lives of children with learning disabilities. And at the end, we'll talk about where we're going in the future. One of the interesting things about the history is that we have the relationship of brain and behavior was identified very early in the field. And we still use this research today to think about how we provide intervention in my area in particular of learning disabilities, which is dyslexia or reading disabilities. Pierre Paul Broca and Carl Wernicke actually identified areas of the brain that were really important in understanding speech and language. And this set the foundation for what has been studied throughout the history of learning disabilities. But as early as 1860, through the autopsies of brain injured soldiers, Broca actually identified the left side of the brain. If you look at the image, you'll see in the front is Broca's area. A little further back is Wernicke's area. But both of these researchers found that it was the left side of the brain dealing with speech and language that were impacted. So in Wernicke, also the left side of the brain, determined the left side of the brain controlled speech, and found that individuals that had deficits in that area had less fluent, meaningless speech and problems understanding speech. So early on, we identified in our history that speech and language was a critical aspect of learning disabilities. Further in that period, in the 1870s, we have other researchers who looked at head injury, and also Kussmaul identified the idea of word blindness. So the understanding that this wasn't an issue of sight, there was not a visual aspect to this. Intellect was intact, sight was intact, speech is intact, but they had a specific deficit in understanding how to read words. And you'll see that if you think about our current definition today, in terms of the federal definition, those things that we have to rule out. So we have to rule out, it has to be a deficit that is not a result of sight, intellect, and other areas. So you can see how the field was influenced by these early researchers. We move then into the foundation period, where we have Samuel Orton and Sam Kirk. And if you'll notice, for Marion Monroe, I only have a picture of a book. If you can guess, when I tried to search for a picture of Marion Monroe, guess what I found? No Marion Monroe. Yes, so we almost put a picture of Marilyn Monroe in here just to see if anybody noticed, but unfortunately, Marilyn Monroe, we couldn't find a photo of her, but we did find a photo of her book. So let's go through the foundation period and see what was contributed during this time. So Samuel Orton in 1925 had a mobile clinic where he was implementing interventions for 14 children who had reading problems. And he focused on mixed dominance and reversals. Interestingly, he focused also on phonics instruction, letter sounds plus blending, and used multisensory instruction. It's interesting to me to see how as far back as 1920, we knew that phonics instruction was a critical component of the instruction that students with reading difficulties and specifically dyslexia needed. In the US Foundation period, we also have Marion Monroe, not Marilyn Monroe, who published a book in 1932, Children Who Cannot Read. And she also reported on several experiments using phonics and multisensory instruction. She was the first to come up with the idea of the ability achievement discrepancy, and the idea of using data to inform instruction. So today that we look at that as CBM. So again, the history leads to where we are today. And then I have a short video to show you. It's just a little over a minute about Sam Kirk's story, how he got involved in the field of learning disabilities.
Samuel Kirk arrived at the University of Illinois in the middle of a career that would revolutionize education for both gifted and challenged students. Kirk came to Illinois at the insistence of Ray Graham, then director of the Division of Exceptional Children for the state of Illinois. Kirk told Graham that he would come to Illinois only if he would get a research center. In 1947, Kirk accepted the offer of a double appointment in psychology and education. A few years later, he initiated the Institute for Research on Exceptional Children. Kirk also created the Illinois Test of Psycholinguistic Abilities. This research refuted the claim that children who scored low on IQ tests were mentally disabled. This led him to coin the term learning disabilities. Samuel Kirk strongly believed that his undergraduate and graduate students should be part of professional organizations. He was known for driving them to meetings in his own car. And according to one of his former doctoral students, Kirk would throw parties several times a year and teach everyone to polka whether they wanted to or not. Upon his death, Kirk's obituary in the New York Times read, "Samuel A. Kirk, an immigrant homesteader's son who became so intrigued by his childhood experiences teaching illiterate farmhands to read that he went on to an acclaimed career as the father of special education." The obituary quotes Kirk's brother, who said the farmhands were drawn to Kirk and would shun the pool table to listen to him teach.
So it would not be appropriate to be speaking to the Illinois Council of Exceptional Children without giving Sam Kirk time in this presentation.
Samuel.
So Samuel Kirk, in his first edition of Educating Exceptional Children, identified a learning disability, or defined it as this: a learning disability refers to a retardation, disorder, or delayed development in one or more of the processes of speech, language, reading, writing, arithmetic, or other school subject resulting from a psychological handicap caused by a possible cerebral dysfunction and/or emotional or behavioral disturbances. It is not the result of mental retardation, sensory deprivation, or cultural and instructional factors. So you can see in this definition where we are with the federal definition today and similarities, across the two definitions. So what else? Obviously, Kirk is a significant contributor to the field. He recommended learning disabilities to replace perceptually handicapped to a Chicago parent group. And as a result, the parents formed the Association for Children with Learning Disabilities, which is now LDA. In 1968, he formed the Division for Learning Disabilities of the Council for Exceptional Children, and convened multiple task forces across the 1960s, including the National Advisory Committee on Handicapped Children. So as you can see, he was instrumental in two of the largest organizations in the field of learning disabilities, LDA and DLD. We then hit what some call the turbulent period. During this period, 1985 to 2000, we had research on phonological processing. Marilyn Adams published the book Beginning to Read, Thinking and Learning About Print, which has provided a lot of the foundation of what we know about how to teach reading now. And it was the time where we had the discovery of the causal relationship between phonemic awareness and reading ability. So there had been many studies that showed a correlational relationship where students who had deficits in phonemic awareness typically had deficits in reading, which led to causal experimental studies that determined that that phonemic awareness is directly related to reading ability, and that lack of phonemic awareness results in reading disability. There was also an emphasis on inclusion during the regular education initiative, and a concern over identification processes, with people questioning discrepancy formula and also disproportionate representation. During this period, we could go on and talk more about the functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI studies that further validated the early research. We also can look, we would be remiss if we didn't mention Naomi Zygmunt's work in showing that full inclusion is not always effective for students with learning disabilities, because they can't receive the intensive instruction that they need. And we know that one size doesn't fit all, and we really do need that intensive individualized instruction. So there was a lot happening during this period, and hopefully we've emerged from the turbulent period into what I think is what we're calling an evidence-based period, where we are now able to really focus on what we know the research says and how to apply this research to best meet the needs of students with learning disabilities. So I'll pause there. That was a very quick overview. And so because I do want to think about where we are going in the future and how this history shapes where we are today and where we want to advance in the field. These are some of the articles that I mentioned. Dan and I are writing now, The History and Future of Learning Disabilities, Advancing the Field Through the Science of Reading. So hopefully that will be something that you'll see soon. But there are two other chapters that we've listed here. I also have an additional article that we can post in the chat at the end. But any questions, Paula, in the chat so far?
At this, let's see, let me just I think we're all right. Anybody who has a question, please unmute yourself and don't hesitate, please. Excuse me.
All right.
Yeah, thank
So-
you.
So I'm going to just jump into the science of reading now. And so many of you have probably heard about the science of reading, and like many terms in education, we start using this term and sometimes it may get overused and people don't really understand what it is. And so what we want to think about is how the science of reading actually impacts what we do as special education teachers and how we implement evidence-based instruction to all students. So what is the science of reading? And this is where, I get pretty excited about sharing where we are as a field now in terms of what we know and what we're able to do as a result of all of the history and research that has gotten us to the place we are. But the science of reading simply is the body of knowledge that comprises 30 plus years of research on reading development, reading difficulties, instruction, and content. So we understand now what's happening in the brain. We understand instructional practices that are effective for teaching students with dyslexia, as well as students who struggle to read for other reasons. We also know the content of the instruction that should be included. We know that we have to have phonemic awareness, decoding, fluency, comprehension, vocabulary, that each of these build on one another, but that the central goal of reading is comprehension. So all of the science of reading simply is the body of research that helps us understand what and how to teach students with disabilities. Learning to read is a complex task, and for many students, it is something that is, they go to first grade, or now seems like kindergarten now, they enter kindergarten knowing that this is the year they're going to learn to read, and things seem to click. The instruction is effective for them and they learn to read. Kids don't learn to read just by happenstance. We have to teach them through explicit instruction, and that's all kids, both kids with disabilities and kids without disabilities. But children with learning disabilities or dyslexia have a specifically difficult time learning how to read. So why is it so hard to learn how to read? We have reading skills, we have background knowledge, other types of knowledge, cognitive processes, and language that are all needing to work together in order to develop a skilled reader. So let's think about what learners need to know and be able to do to be successful readers. And you can just, in the chat, I encourage you to drop in what you think kids need to know and be able to do to be successful readers. And to help you think about this, I put two passages. I put an Urdu passage and a passage in Scottish Gaelic. And is there anybody in here who can read either of those languages? If you can read those languages, just unmute yourself and let me know. Okay, so we don't have anyone who is fluent in Urdu or Scottish Gaelic. So what that does is it puts all of us in the same place. We are all non-readers. For the first time since we were little, we are non-readers. Now, what do you need to know and be able to do to be a successful reader of these two languages? Just go ahead and drop those things in the chat. Okay, letter sound correspondence and alphabetic principle. What else?
It would help to have a picture of some sort.
Okay, we need concepts of print, all right?
Yeah.
If we had a picture, we might be able to activate our background knowledge to know what the passages were about.
I do know that the word uber is work, Paige.
Okay.
Obair is in Gaelic, but there are a couple of different versions of Gaelic, but uber is work. I could just pick a few little small things, but it's really, August is end, AGUS is end at the very end there.
Yeah, so we've got some good things coming in the chat as well. We would need to know that the sounds go with the symbols, and then understand the meaning of those sounds, the meaning of the words, vocabulary, phonetics of words, and proper pronunciation. When the characters come together, what sounds do they make? All right, and I'm going to actually let you listen to the Urdu.
पढ़ना एक पेचीदा काम है जिसके लिए मुतअद्दिद सब सक्स के इंज़िमाम की ज़रूरत होती है। उन सब सक्स को अली दर्जे की दुरुस्तगी और खुदकारी के साथ लागू किया जाना चाहिए।
Did that help you understand what we were reading? No. So you need to have an understanding of the language. Somebody mentioned the meaning of the words, vocabulary. You need to have a strong understanding of the language. If you notice, let's listen again and see if you can figure out where one word starts and one word begins, where the separation between words.
पढ़ना एक पेचीदा काम है जिसके लिए मुतअद्दिद सब सर्कल्स के इंज़िमाम की ज़रूरत होती है। उन सब सर्कल्स को अली दर्जे की दुरुस्तगी और खुदकारी के साथ लागू किया जाना चाहिए।
I think I heard a pause between sentences, but could you hear pauses between words? Not really. It just sounded like one big, not at all. No, it sounded like one big blob of speech. That's why we need phonological awareness, and more specifically in terms of reading, phonemic awareness. So let's think about, you've come up with a lot of ideas, but the bottom line is what we know from this passage is that, and what the passage says, is that reading is a complex task, is the first sentence. Reading is a complex task, and it requires the integration of multiple sub-skills in order to be a successful reader. And I may not have gotten that exactly right, but that's essentially what these two passages in Urdu and Scottish Gaelic say. It is a complex task, and it requires the integration of many sub-skills. And we have to do those sub-skills. We do them so automatically, we don't even realize we're doing them. We're going to break that down today and think about what's happening when a skilled reader reads and understand what we need to do to teach children to be successful readers. So let's look at a conceptual framework for literacy. If you notice in this particular framework, we have reading comprehension in the middle. And then there are four primary areas around that: language, knowledge, metacognition, and fluency. If we take any one of these, let's start with language. What language knowledge and skills do you need? You need to have oral language skills, knowledge of language in general. You need to have vocabulary. There are cultural influences and language comprehension. All are parts of language that impact reading comprehension. So reading comprehension is the ultimate goal of reading, but you have all of these influences. You also have fluency. So fluency is highly predictive of whether you understand what you read, but it's bidirectional. When you read fluently, you're able to understand what you read, but when you're understanding, you're able to add that prosody, that making the language, making your reading sound like spoken language. And so you know where to pause and how to use inflection appropriately because you understand what the author is saying in the message. So fluency includes prosody, automaticity, and reading rate. Automaticity means that decoding words that you haven't seen before automatically, and rate is making your reading at a rate that facilitates understanding. You have to have decoding accuracy. You have to have phonemic awareness. Then knowledge. What knowledge do you need to bring to reading? You have your life experiences, the knowledge of content and different topical knowledge. Having the knowledge isn't enough. You also need to be able to activate that knowledge. You need to also have knowledge about text, letters, and orthography. And then if that's not enough, we also have metacognition, which is the motivation and engagement, active reading strategies, monitoring strategies, fix-up strategies, thinking and reasoning. All of these things are happening simultaneously. And now if you'll think just a moment, and you can put it in the chat, or you can just on your own, just think about this question: which of these areas is most affected by for students who have a learning disability, or specifically dyslexia? And how might that differ from someone who perhaps lacks background knowledge, but has all of the other pieces intact? Okay, so you can keep that in your mind as we go through the rest. All right, before we get into the specific aspects of reading, I want to talk about what explicit instruction is and what systematic instruction is. And the reason we do this, just as I mentioned earlier, that the science of reading, we sometimes use a term and it almost becomes cliche. Oh, well, this is based on the science of reading. Well, this is an evidence-based practice. Well, this is explicit and systematic. What does it mean to be explicit? And then we're going to talk about what it means to be systematic. Then we'll go through what are the things that we need to teach explicitly and systematically. So in explicit instruction, the teacher is clearly, overtly, and thoroughly communicating to the student how to do something. We're not leaving anything to chance. We are saying, this is how you do it. We're modeling, we're demonstrating, we're showing how something works. Explicit instruction uses explicit teaching demonstration. So model, the teacher demonstrates the strategy, the teacher guides the student in the strategy, and the teacher asks the student to apply the strategy without assistance. We control the language used in teaching skills and strategies so that the cognitive effort that the student is spending is not on trying to figure out what the teacher is saying, analyzing the language, but we use a consistent language and consistent strategies so the student can really focus on the skill that you're trying to teach. We also introduce one new skill at a time instead of many skills, and we provide the opportunity for guided practice. So this is what it means to be explicit. We are teaching someone how to do something very clearly and overtly. We're communicating it without, we're not trying to discover something. There are times that kids can discover something. They can't discover the sound of T unless we tell them what sound what sound goes with the letter T. What about systematic instruction? Systematic instruction utilizes an optimal order for introducing new information and strategies. We're going to teach pre-skills before the strategy is presented. So all of this, if you need to have, it's like task analyzing. If these are the skills you need to do a strategy, then you need to teach those skills first. We're also going to introduce high utility skills before less useful ones. Obviously, this is probably the one that makes most sense without really even thinking about it. Easy skills before more difficult ones. And we separate strategies and information likely to be confused. So when we're teaching letters and letter sounds, we used to do a letter of the week in kindergarten. And what would happen? We teach A, and then we teach B, and then we teach C, and then we teach D. You've just taught B, and now you're learning D. They're very similar in both sound and appearance. So we want to separate visually and auditorily similar information. We also want to introduce new information at a realistic rate. And notice I'm not saying we need to introduce X number of letters at a time. That's going to be individualized based on the student's needs, and we're going to teach to mastery. So we're going to continue to revisit skills that have already been taught. So we'll provide the adequate practice and review and teach to mastery. So this kind of gets us on the same playing field in terms of how we're defining explicit and systematic instruction. And this can go across all content areas, but we'll talk about it specifically and apply these as it relates to reading instruction for students with learning disabilities today. Any questions or comments about letter sounds? I see a question. I struggle with the order of teaching alphabet sounds systematically. There are several systems that indicate different order, and those systems are in different orders, which is best. So that's a really good question. There isn't one order that's best. The key is that you follow these guidelines. So I actually have a presentation that we won't get into as much detail today, but specifically, how do you determine the order of letters to teach? And I can send Paula a handout that she can provide to you and to your group. But essentially what you want to make sure is that when you're teaching letter sounds, you're going to teach continuous sounds before stop sounds. A continuous sound is a sound that you can hold out without elongation. So all of the vowels are continuous. Stop sounds that are you have stop voice consonants and you have stop unvoiced consonants. The sound for T is T. That's pretty easy to say in isolation, but the sound for D is much more difficult because it's a voice consonant. And I could do an hour just on the sounds and the order of the sounds. And so we won't get into that today too much, but the main thing is separating auditorily and visually similar information, teach letters that are going to be high utility letters and letters that can be used to blend more words together early, and also make sure that you separate those letters that look look alike or sound alike? And then I'll provide a handout for you all on that. Okay, really good question. So why is systematic instruction important? You may meet your goal with unsystematic instruction, but it's going to be substantially less effective. And if you look at number one, you might have gotten to number two in how to tie a tie. Do you think you could ever repeat that? So you might have gotten lucky and figured it out this time, but now the next time you're gonna have to start all over again and try to figure it out again. When we teach systematically, we can be much more effective and more efficient so that we can have students repeat that same pattern and structure and be able to then replicate that and generalize to another skill. So this is just to be indicates how important the systematized instruction is. Okay. All right, now let's go back. I mentioned earlier that we are going to talk about what a skilled reader does. In the history, we mentioned Marilyn Adams' 1990 book, Beginning to Read, Thinking and Learning About Print. This book is a seminal work that really has launched us into thinking and understanding the science of reading. And so in this model, you see, just like in that conceptual framework, you have meaning in the middle. But what I want you to look, as you look at this model, what I want you to think about is where we enter this process. So this is based on a process called parallel distributed processing. But all of this is happening not simultaneously, but almost simultaneously. There is an order of how we go through this process. We do it so automatically, we don't even realize it. So we have the orthographic processor. That's when your brain takes in orthographic information. That's then translated to the phonological processor, which is the sound. So we've got letters, we've got sounds. The context is going to clarify what it means in a particular situation. And because of the context processor, we can bring meaning to the print. So the question is, where do we enter this process? Anybody? So it's either orthographic, phonological, meaning, or context. Take a stab at where you think we enter the process when we read. Is it the orthographic processor, phonological processor, meaning processor, or context processor?
I'm here. We're seeing meaning and context in the chat. Another meaning. I think you can see that yourself, Paige.
I'm seeing it now.
Yeah.
Well, I'm here to kind of, we've got meaning and context, and you think we're going, because of the model, maybe we're working from the top, but what I want you to do, and I'm going to grab a book. And because I'm a reading teacher, I have books all over the place. This is Over and Under the Snow. When I start reading this page, so here's the page, what is the first thing that my brain has to consider when I read? The first thing that I see when I pulled this book out, the first thing I saw was this word, over. That means that what I first processed was orthographic. We entered the reading process through the orthographic processor. I looked at this word over, and without even realizing it, my eyes identified the letters in the word. I then moved over to the phonological processor, and I matched the sounds that these letters can make. And then I phonologically recoded, or I put them back together. Then I read the rest of it, Over and Under the Snow. The context processor clicked in, and I started thinking about, okay, so this is a snowy day. The word snow activated my the context that we're talking about, over and under, so something buried under the snow. So it wasn't until after I actually looked at the words that my context and meaning processors actually clicked in. So the skilled reader enters the process by attending to the orthography. We look at print first. And then through a process of orthographic mapping, we link the grapheme, the letter or letters that make a particular sound, to the phonological representation. And then through another process called phonological recoding, we reconstitute or blend those phonemes together. Now, you probably don't even realize that you do that, but we know from eye gaze study that we didn't even mention in the history that we process every letter and every word and every word in every sentence when we read. We just do it so automatically that we don't realize it. So what happens in this particular situation is we see this word WIND. The orthographic processor kicks in and I think about the letters I see and I match them to the sounds. Well, notice I have both the sound for the short I and the long I. These are the phonological, the phonemic transcription. And then D, D, U, I. So my brain is going through all of those. So my kite was flying in the, and I've got either wind or wind. That's where the context processor then chooses that it's wind, and then I can bring meaning to that sentence. My kite was flying in the wind. But the first place we entered was with the print. Is there a similar process for English language learners? Good question. So with English language learners, it's going to be a similar process. What's challenging is that the language barrier, because they may not have the proper context, the understanding of the vocabulary to be able to use that context and meaning processor. So particularly with students who are Spanish speaking students, who are Spanish is their native language, that's also an alphabetic language. And so they may be able to get through the orthographic and phonological processor just fine. But then when they get to the context and meaning processor, that becomes more challenging because they don't have the context or they don't have the word, the same word. One of the things that we're doing now, we're actually are studying whether, we're studying this now, so that if you implement a reading intervention in to English language learners, if we first introduce a book in their native language to teach them the vocabulary and the context and the meaning, and then they learn to read that book in English. So we're building that background knowledge and the language so they understand. And then you teach them how to decode the words, then you can apply that background knowledge and meaning processor. I don't have any answers for you yet, but my hypothesis is that if we can teach them that vocabulary in their native language, that they'll be able to then apply the orthographic and phonological processor and connect that with the context and meaning processor, and ultimately be able to understand what they read more effectively. So might it be different sequentially for English language learners or sequential bilinguals? I think we still need to study this. I know that the orthographic and phonological processor is still going to work in the same way. The context and meaning processor is going to work in the same way, but how do we set them up for success to make sure that they have the language? Because when we know that when you enter kindergarten, that language experience from birth to age 5 and the vocabulary that you bring is going to impact how well you are able to learn to decode and to comprehend. Because if you don't have a word in your speaking vocabulary, it's much more difficult, even if you're able to use the orthographic and phonological processor to be able to blend and decode that word. So I think we still have a lot to learn about English language learners, but we do know that we know that reading in your native language, those skills transfer to learning how to read in English. All right, so let's think about implications for students with dyslexia when we going back to the Adams model. And actually we could go back to that conceptual framework and thinking about, I asked the question, where might students with dyslexia have a breakdown that occurs in that conceptual framework or an Adams model? And then how do we teach to make sure that we help students with dyslexia learn to read. On the other hand, we can ask the same question: what area of the conceptual framework or of Adam's model of the reading process is going to affect students who are English language learners? And then thirdly, what area of Adam's model of the reading process is going to be affected most by students who may be having less opportunity to experience language from birth to 5, who may be coming from impoverished backgrounds, etc. So depending upon the students that we're teaching, different areas of this process may be affected differentially. So in Adam's model of the reading process, we have the phonological processor, the orthographic processor, the context processor, and the meaning processor. For the skilled reader, as you'll see, all of the parts of the brain are working really well. They're just humming along. This is where you've got all 4 of Adam's processors are working almost simultaneously, so that it's a skilled reader is just the way we described with this book, over and under the snow. I was able to look at the representation of the letters, the sounds, use context and meaning. And then with students with dyslexia, there's a phonological deficit. There can also be a rapid automatized naming deficit. When you have, these are 2 areas that are highly implicated in dyslexia, which are part of working memory, which is part of the phonological processing disorder. And notice how if you have a phonological deficit, how the process slows down. And then if you have both, considered a double deficit, the rapid automatized naming, it's even slower. So things are not going to work as efficiently. And Paula, can we do a time check? I don't have any idea.
Certainly can. Thank you so very much. 9:48, Paige.
Okay.
Just flies away on us, doesn't it?
It does indeed, but there have been good questions. So I'm just going to go through this really quickly. Deficits in phonological processing are the most common type of disability, of cause of reading disability or dyslexia. And it affects the ability to decode individual words and the components of words. A deficit in some aspect of phonological processing is the most common cause of reading disability. And that can be phonological awareness, phonological memory, or rapid automatized naming, or any combination. Which of these can we teach? Phonological awareness, phonological memory, or rapid automatized naming? Anybody have an idea? It's difficult to teach phonological memory or rapid automatized naming, but we can teach phonological awareness. That's absolutely right, Maria. I'm going to go through this very quickly, just given the time that we have. But the phonological loop is important because it's the component of working memory that's involved in storing phonological information, and it consists of the phonological store and the articulatory control. Just to say this in plain English and make it easier, it's basically like a tape recorder in our head, in our brain, that plays the most recent information that we receive auditorily. So the way I think about this is I go and in the old days, I look up a phone number in the phone book. Yes, the C-top. So I look up a phone number in the phone book. I repeat that number over and over in my head, 972-7272, because I want to go order a pizza. That refreshing it, that loop refreshes it so that when I get to the phone, I can pick up the phone and dial it. I remember that information, but then it's gone. Students with difficulty in either the phonological store or the articulatory control process can't hold on to new information and can't refresh that information. And so it's gone immediately. Not so important for reading common known words, but think about when you are decoding a long word like this one. If I start doing this sound by sound across, by the time I get to the end, what I said at the beginning, I'm going to forget. So U, G, G. Now I've already forgotten. So if I do what's called successive blending, so that I can pull this all together, it's going to help me. And so successive blending is something that's important for students with dyslexia. So bur, lu, burlu, g, gug, burlugug, and burlugug and doplo. So obviously, when we do that successive blending, that's going to be helpful. I'm going to speed through this just to get through a few more things before we have to give a little time for questions at the end. So what are the implications for teaching? It's going to impair the decoding of new words. So when students with dyslexia or phonological processing difficulties get to words they don't know, they need to be able to have a strategy to blend through those words and be able to figure out what that word says. So what it means is that we need to teach with synthetic phonics, which includes blending and segmenting of sounds, teach successive blending in decoding practice. We have to build automaticity with common, less difficult words, and we have to build automaticity with orthographic patterns. And this is something that we often don't give enough attention to, but we know that children who are fluent in recognizing orthographic patterns are able to read more fluently than students who are less efficient at recognizing those orthographic patterns. The cognitive load for decoding is going to differ depending on the difficulty of the words. So words like that, and be are pretty light cognitive load, but a word like appropriate, which is multisyllabic, and we have some different, not as regular spelling patterns, is going to be a higher cognitive load. I'm going to skip this part now. I'm going to go to orthographic processing, because this is something that I think is one that we give less attention to than we do phonological processing. But orthographic processing is that interletter association and the speed recognition of both regularly and irregularly spelled words. There are letters that we see frequently together and experienced by the reader, and that's going to help consolidate the unit in memory. For example, the letter T is 50 times more likely to be followed by an H than it is an O. Thus, TH is an orthographic unit that will speed the reading of words that contain that letter pattern. Yes, you can have the handout. You're talking about the presentation, Liana? I will give you that, and I will give you a handout that goes along with it as well. The orthographic processor and the phonological processor are distinct from one another, but each is vulnerable to its own types of errors. So let's think about orthographic processing, because again, this is not something we talk about a lot. So we know that TH is a unit we want to have in memory because it's 50 times more likely to be followed, a T is 50 times more likely to be followed by an H. There's your systematic instruction. Remember we talked about high frequency sounds being taught first. So when we think about orthographic patterns, we want to think about the orthographic patterns that are more common as well. So let's look at the next slide. Consider the two interletter associations, DR and DN. Which of these letters is more common in English? Just drop it in. Do you see DR in English print, or do you see DN in English print more frequently? All right, DR, you're right. So now I want you to look at all the words. I just brainstormed a list of words. These are the first ones that came to mind with DR and words with DN. And I want to take just a moment for you to look at these words and tell me the difference that you see in these two words, these two sets of words. Does anybody notice a pattern with the words that have DN in them?
They link two pieces like mid and night.
Right, they link two pieces. That is when you see a D and an N, that's usually going to be indicative of where a syllable, there is a syllable break. So for multisyllabic words, if you recognize that when you have a D and an N together, it's likely going to be a break point where you separate it, but you get two consonants together like that that are not a consonant blend or consonant digraph, then that's going to be a place where you divide a word. We can actually explicitly teach students to recognize these points so that they can break long words into parts. That is the power of orthographic processing and how important orthography is in learning how to read. Orthographic mapping, we talked about the Urdu. For decoding, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the symbols, we're going to match them to their phonemes, and then we're going to be able to blend them together to make words. What about automaticity and the sight word store? We also need to look at orthographic patterns, phonemes, and the lexicon. When we go through this orthographic mapping, you have the written word, then you phonologically recode. The more times you phonologically recode, it becomes consolidated as a word and long-term memory, and that's where you get the automaticity. And we probably should stop here because, I mean, I could go on for another long time about this process in the science of reading. So let me just stop for a little. I'm going to do one. Actually, I only have a few more slides. I'm just going to go for it. Okay. Let's see. So in orthographic mapping, we use phonological recoding. And what you're doing is you're mapping each individual letter or letters to the sounds that they make. This is their the phonetic transcription. We actually go through this process multiple times, even with regular and irregular words. And the more we do that, it becomes consolidated in memory. We recode. So you decode the word once, you decode the word twice, you decode the word 3 times, you orthographically map it. It becomes a sight word, meaning you recognize it by sight. But we're still going to process all of the letters and sounds in the words. What's important to know about this is that a student without a reading disability may be able to orthographically map a word like because 3 times, and then they have it consolidated in memory. For a student with dyslexia, they may have to orthographically map it 20 times before it comes consolidated in memory. So we have to intensify the instruction in order to get the same result. Does it mean they can't build sight vocabulary? Not at all. It means that they are going to have to go through that orthographic mapping process more frequently. So orthographic, phonemic, and then it develops into your lexicon. We actually even do this with irregular words. We orthographically map irregular words. It's just that the irregular sound is not the highest frequency sound that the letter or letters makes. And that's important too, to be able to take kids through that process of actually orthographic mapping of irregular words. And this is where context comes in, because you're going to phonologically recode. And if you get to an approximation, your context processor and your meaning processor kick in. So the meaning and context processors arouse an appropriate response to the orthographic image. And that orthographic image is reinforced from the feedback. And the more often it's reinforced, the quicker it becomes automatic. One more important thing to think about in terms of implications for instruction, and this is why I decided not to stop, but just to push through. Reading begins with the orthographic input, letters. So there has been this idea that the 3 cueing systems, graphophonemic, syntax, and semantics are all important. They are all included in text, but they're not equally important in terms of the order in which we use them. The orthographic inputs interacts with phonology. And if you look at the other information, like pictures, you actually slow down the process and you're less efficient in building your lexicon through orthographic mapping. So instead of this, we're going to think of it like this. You're going to direct students when you're teaching reading to decode the words through orthographic mapping. You're going to use syntactic and semantic information to confirm decoding accuracy and cross-check. So first you decode, then you use context and meaning to check to see if your decoding was accurate. You teach self-correction strategies explicitly. You use meaning and context to confirm, self-check, and teach self-correction strategies. Good readers decode first and then use context to confirm, as opposed to the other way around. And so that's one kind of takeaway message in a very brief kind of overview of the science of reading. If you want more information about these things, I work at the University of Florida Lastinger Center for Learning, and we have, what I have been able to do over the last 5 years, I left University of Virginia in my tenure track research position and went to the Lastinger Center, where I could begin really bridging that research to practice gap. And we have created a series of professional development initiatives. And so this is just a list of the different pieces and parts that we have to really help make sure teachers understand the science of reading and how to apply these strategies in their classroom. So if you want more about it, to know more about it, you can Google University of Florida Lastinger Center, and you can look at the different models that we have online. So that's I know I talked fast, but I will send Paula some handouts of the things that you mentioned were of interest to you. And I think we might have a little bit of time for questions.
Thank you so much, Paige and Dan, also for being here and for sharing this such a beautiful expose on such a complicated matter in such a short duration. Please unmute yourself if you have a question. We welcome you to do that. And shall we, we can, yeah, Pat, let's hear it. Do you have a question, Pat?
Well, no, I just unmuted myself, that was all.
Okay. Oh, good. Unmute yourself and don't hesitate to jump in if you have pressing question.
Questions or comments?
Well, thank you very much. I think it's been extremely helpful, even though I'm retired, but it brings back a lot of memories.
Good. I'm glad.
Paige, we have a question about a curriculum.
Mm-hmm.
A curriculum, do you recommend?
Do I recommend a particular curriculum?
For teaching reading?
So there are, the main thing that I don't know about one particular curriculum. I hesitate to say that there's one. There are curricula that teach the science of reading, and I don't know that there's one that's absolutely perfect, but what you want to look at is making sure that it is comprehensive, that it includes opportunities for children to work in small group instruction. That is critical. Small group instruction is critical, that there is systematic and explicit instruction in synthetic phonics. Synthetic phonics should be is the type of phonics system that is most effective based on research. Open Court is one that I will say that does meet those standards. There are others as well, and I couldn't begin to list all of them. There are other curricula out there as well. And are you thinking more of a core curricula as opposed to intervention? I think that's key too. So I can give you some. Why don't I send a handout about curricula as well? I hesitate to say any one particular curricula.
We have unmute yourself, Sarah. Sarah Briggs, you raised your hand.
I have a comment and a question. When you were going through the slides and you showed the dates for the problematic period, I would say that was the time that I was becoming a special education teacher. So, and it feels like depending on when you went through your program, it's almost like you have to go through a second professional development of learning how to teach, because some of the methods that we were taught to teach are now based on the reading science, maybe not the most appropriate way to teach reading instruction. And my question is, I know that the district that I currently am in are really working to push out structured literacy. is that similar to this? Because I'm really just trying to learn. Like
it is, you know, and so structured literacy block, basically, when you have your English language arts block, you want that to be comprehensive, and you want to make sure that you have a core phonics program. I think that's one of the pieces that was missing. So, you know, that period that you went through school to be a special education teacher, that's when I went through as well. And the push at the time in the 80s and early 90s was whole language. And really, that's when the 3 cueing systems was really big, and meaning was the emphasis as opposed to phonics. And it wasn't that letters and sounds weren't taught, but it was much more, it was not explicit and systematic. It was more either embedded or incidental. And so what you want is to create, I mean, I would say have a core phonics program that follows the guidelines that I mentioned earlier, that you have a comprehensive program that includes small group instruction, as well as perhaps large whole group phonics instruction, that every day children have an opportunity to read with an adult with corrective feedback, that every day children have an opportunity to connect reading and writing, to understand how reading and writing work together, that every day children are able to read books that they are able to read with over 95% accuracy, so that they can practice and build fluency. That every day we are collecting data, and we are using the data to inform our decisions as to what we teach. So we're implementing curriculum-based measures, and we're looking at the letters and sounds kids have learned and the ones they need to know, and that we're providing that instruction, that we're teaching to mastery. You know, the other thing is how we choose books to read to students. Now there's this big push to do only decodable books, or as opposed to books that are predictive, or books that are, you know, authentic. And what I would say is we do want to stay away from those that are really predictive and patterned, unless you're really young. That by kindergarten, you really should have an opportunity to read text that allows you to implement your decoding skill. That said, we do not have any research that suggests that decodable text is better than authentic text, or the other way around. Instead, we have to make our teaching very intentional, and that when you select something to read with a student, that you're selecting based on your purpose. So if your purpose is to practice a phonic element that you just taught, and you want to have them in contrived decodable text to practice that skill, that would be appropriate. If you're focusing on making sure that students are able to decode a variety of words, then maybe you want to have books that have a high percentage of words that are decodable, but that are authentic text. And we also have to make sure that we are providing children opportunities to come across words that are irregular, and that they know how to read those words. So everything we do in reading instruction should be intentional, and that we select the materials, the curriculum, the instructional strategies. All of those should be based in the data that we have on our students, and that we are teaching and selecting with a purpose. But Sarah, I appreciate your question, because I went through, I have to say that I actually went back and worked on my PhD because I felt like I didn't know how to teach children how to read. I'm like, well, I must have missed that day in class. And so when I started, was teaching in an intervention classroom with kids who couldn't read, because I taught in a general education classroom, and I say that kids were learning to read in spite of me, not because of me. And it dawned on me that I really need to learn how to do this. And so I've spent the last 25 plus years learning how to teach reading well, and then how to translate that, what I've learned, to make it applicable and accessible to teachers.
Thank you.
This is Judy McKinley calling from California. I ask how this affects children who just are automatically reading without any particular structure to it. How does this affect what goes on with those children in a classroom?
So children who are reading without any, I'm sorry, can you say the question again?
Without any necessary instruction, particularly, they're just reading.
Okay, so they've just started to read on their own and didn't have any instruction, you're saying?
Right.
Okay, so here's the thing about that. So all children need explicit instruction. And so my son, who's 17 now, entered kindergarten already knowing how to read. I did not sit him down and teach him 100 easy lessons. I didn't sit him down and do direct instruction or anything else, but he got to kindergarten, and I mean like that, he was reading. But let's think about his experiences. There's an implicit to explicit continuum. And so some people might say, well, he just got to school and he just learned to read, regardless, he didn't get any instruction. But from birth to age 5, there were things that happened in his life that were explicit instruction, even though it wasn't in a systematic way in terms of sitting him down and doing 100 easy lessons to teach your child to read. At 2 years old, we were playing with letters in the bathtub, and I would say, this is a T. T says, look, we can make the word, and we would play with letters. We would play with sounds. That is explicit instruction. So the kids that seem like they're learning to read without explicit instruction are kids that have received explicit instruction somewhere along the line. And then when we get into classrooms and they're able to then take implicit instruction, or what seems to be happening without a curriculum or any type of structure, we just think, well, they're reading in spite of it. It's because they've already had that. It's not that they never had explicit instruction, it's that they had it earlier in a way that that is not the traditional first time you learn to read is in kindergarten. I didn't teach Gabriel how to read per se, but at 3 years old, we were reading a book. It was called My Crayons Talk. And it's My Crayons Talk, 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 talk. And there were these different colors. And it's like, green means fun, watch me run. And it was a child running across the grass. And I turned the page, it was the red page. I don't remember what the red page was, but he said, turn back, mommy, turn back. I can rhyme my words. And I said, you can. And so I turned back and he said, watch me rhyme my words. And he picked up his finger and there was a stop sign with the word stop on it. And he goes, stop, stop. And he blended those words, he blended the word stop. And I was like, to myself, I'm thinking, well, that's not exactly rhyming, but that's pretty incredible because I had never actually sat down and done that. I might have modeled it. I'd say, look, this is stop, stop. And he then copied. So then on the post of the sign, it said red. And I said, well, rhyme your words here. Do that again. And he started with the D and he goes, d, e, er. And I said, start it this way. Start with the R. And he goes, red, red. So at 3 years old, he had figured out, because of all the experiences that we had had, how to blend across those sounds. He's an avid reader today, was reading Chronicles of Narnia in kindergarten. So people would say, well, he learned to read without instruction, but he really didn't. And so what do we do with those children in terms of instructionally? They still have a lot to learn and a lot of room to grow. So we shift the instruction then, and we are focusing more on meaning at that point and how to gain meaning from text, and maybe using graphic organizers and learning how to do take notes from nonfiction text. But the bottom line is that they got instruction somewhere along the way.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
Good.
Beautiful clarification.
Yes.
Clarification. Implicit, explicit instruction continuum. That's a wonderful idea. And I think, Paige, another thing I'm hearing today is the incredible importance of alphabet books for young children.
Well, yes. I mean, I think reading in general to young children and making sure children have the opportunity to learn letters and sounds. Alphabet books are one way, but books in general, so for Gabriel, if I think back to my own experiences, from the time he was born, we read books. And so we would read 3 books every night. And it was that ritual, that pattern. And then, the more, think about what you're learning in that period from birth to 5, he was learning print concepts, how words work on a page. He was learning vocabulary. He was picking up on the letters and sounds that the letters and letter sounds. And it was also the playing with letters in the bathtub and pointing out things in text environmentally. He was surrounded by literacy. And so what that did is, once he got to formal reading instruction, he could benefit from that instruction so quickly that he took off really, really fast. So it's all of those experiences together. Alphabet books will certainly help kids learn the letters of the alphabet. And for parents of younger children, we don't need to worry so much about the sequence of letter instruction. It's that repeated opportunity to interact with print and with text that are going to set them up for success. That doesn't mean that someone who's also had those exact same experience but has dyslexia is going to experience the same thing that Gabriel did. So Dan and I have a grandchild who has had those same experiences, but he has a learning disability. And so learning to read was more difficult for him. He ultimately did learn to read, but he has challenges of orthographic processing. And so spelling is really difficult for him, and recognizing and memorizing those orthographic patterns and being able to pull those from memory. So learning disabilities are real, and we can do all of the things that we just talked about. And for children who don't have a learning disability, that's going to mean that when they get to school, implicit or explicit instruction, they're probably going to learn to read, but they've had the explicit. For someone like our grandchild, even with all those experiences, he needed really explicit, intensive instruction to learn to read and to learn to spell. So that's another really important distinguishing factor between children who may come to school without all of these experiences like Gabriel had and need explicit instruction because we need to be more efficient and catch them up and they don't have some of the background knowledge that they need, compared to someone who's had the background knowledge but who has a phonological processing deficit or orthographic processing deficit, who's going to need specialized instruction. And that is what special education is. And that's why we are all here, to understand what we need to do to be able to make a difference for those children who have had experiences like Gabriel, but still can't learn to read without explicit, systematic, and intentional instruction that is intensive and individualized.
Well, we thank you both. And the time is now 10:19. And thanks a million for being with us this morning.
You are so welcome. And I know I promised a couple of handouts, and so I will get with Paula to make sure I get her those and she can get them out to all